ago to diffuse this whole situation before it turned into a war. Now we got a war over there.
Well, let's talk about what they should do. I mean, number one on the list for me is we should be getting every entrepreneur from around the world, any really intelligent person who wants to go to graduate school here into this country. We need to have like a Manhattan Project to just scoop up all these mutant geniuses from around the world and get them here and get them starting companies here.
You don't even need to do that. It was working.
And don't fuck it up.
Bush, Obama, all you had to do was just leave it alone. Everybody who was any good at anything wanted to come to the United States, including the three of us.
Yep.
And all of a sudden it's like, nah, it's good. Yeah, I'll pass.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you set out that you hate entrepreneurs and you resent them for success, don't be surprised if they want to stay in a country that.
But I don't think that's what it was. I think it was much crueler than that. I think that we went to a posture that said, okay, you know what? Net new immigration was viewed as something that was displacing people, wasn't a net value creator, was, in some cases viewed very xenophobically. And that is really problematic because it's actually about a large population issue. And it's about how you construct a healthy, thriving population.
Yeah. This was Trump's worst approach. He was best approach, clearly not starting wars, worst approach, shutting the borders down for some populist reason when we actually need people in the country.
Well, hold on. But see, the way you just framed that is why I think there's a problem, which is, look, obviously the immigration is a very fraught issue, but the choice that's being presented to us by our political parties is either you're in favor of immigration, like bringing in all these superstars, like we have founders in Silicon Valley, that makes sense, or you're in favor of open borders. I mean, why are those the two choices? That we either have H-1Bs or we have an open border? I mean, that makes no sense. I mean, what we should have is a sensible immigration. First of all, we should strip the border security issue out of it, because whatever the number of immigrants that you want to allow.
Everyone should be pro-border security.
I mean, we need a point-based system. We need to have a reasonable discussion between Democrats and Republicans about a point-based system. There's a qualitative distance.
You've advocated that for a long time, and it works in Canada. And I think you're absolutely
Australia, New Zealand, UK. They all have this. It's like, what does our country need right now? Okay, do we need people, who are laborers, or do we need people starting companies? Do we need, scientists?
I don't know if you've noticed, but to me, this is very equivalent to the removal of SAT and ACT scoring in admissions in college.
Explain.
The notion of merit, the notion of performance is not one that really matters in this country as much right now, as much as the notion of equity. And equity really has kind of become the mainstay of not just how we're making policy decisions on a local level, but a lot of these kind of national issues are becoming about equity. And it's about, equitable consideration for wealth creation for existing citizens in the United States, and the perception that a minority of people or some majority of people actually missed out on significant wealth creation over the past couple of decades as globalization and technology advances have accelerated growth in our economy, and the share of that growth has been disproportionately assigned to a small percentage of people. And I think it is that same notion that drives a lot of the kind of sub decisions, the local decisions that we're making, as well as these important policy decisions. And the point that I think is critical, that's really hard to get across to everyone, or anyone for that matter, is that, and I've talked about this a lot, but progress brings everyone forward, but it doesn't bring everyone forward symmetrically, right? Progress brings everyone forward.
Give an example, Friedberg.
So Amazon's a great example. I've used it a lot. With Amazon, we've all been given access to more goods and cheaper goods than we would have had before. So we all benefit from that progress, right? Everyone can get on an app and get a friggin' inflatable swimming pool delivered to their home and the vitamins they need within 24 hours at half the price of what it would have cost them to go down to the local Ace Hardware store. That's an incredible benefit for all of us. So our share of wallet on that sort of goods has gone down. Therefore, we can spend more, get access to more stuff, and we're all prospering. And if you think back to what life was like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, to those of you who, were spending money 20 years ago or whatever, it's an incredibly different proposition than what we had back then. And it really has changed the world and changed all of us as consumers' ability to consume more. That's amazing. The problem is Jeff Bezos is worth $160 billion. So everyone looks at that and they want to lambaste Jeff Bezos and they want to say, this is unfair. And equity becomes the discussion, which is why is one guy worth $160 billion? The reality is he benefited everyone. Everyone got benefit from the value that he helped create in this world, in this market. And then the reaction is, we got to stop this from happening. We can't let people be worth $160 billion without putting their eye on the point that, you know what, I'm spending $3,000 a year less because of this technology that he brought to market. And so there's a lot of these solutions that I would say are progressive. They progress us all as a society. Everything from biotech to technology and software to any sort of business or services innovation that people are willing to pay money for, that people are willing to embrace in an open and free market. And then what happens is the spoils of that progress aggregate in a small way to a small number of people. And that's the payoff in capitalism. But when that happens over and over again for 250 years, you fast forward, and by the way, a lot of those compound, people wake up and they say, I don't want that anymore. And they miss the fact that progress is taken for granted. And here we are. We want to give up progress and we want to get equity. And it's going to cause a real ripple effect that's going to last for decades. And it's not the first time we've seen it, right? This has happened historically over cycles that last hundreds of years, and it's happening now in the United States and in the entire Western world. And I think it's going to be really unfortunate generally for progress. And all the ones, all the advocates for equity are going to kind of raise their hand.
I think you're totally right. What's the solution? Because it's just a really sad.
I've thought about this a lot. And, I look at what China did, and everyone's going to say I'm pro-China. But what was interesting about China recently is they ratchet up and they ratchet down that free market system. So they allow progress and then they disallow progress when the equity meter goes the wrong way. And so if you kind of think about an equity meter and a progress meter, you have to balance those two over time, because otherwise what happens is you spring back. And then the springing back is when governments change, revolutions happen, democracy falls apart, autocracies arise, all those sorts of awful things. Or really, I would say those cyclical things that happen. I don't want to characterize any of them as good or bad, but the cyclical things that happen with society over time. And so, that is effectively what's happening, guys. Like the ultra high tax rate, the regulatory regime, the government coming in and stopping Facebook. I mean, these sorts of behaviors are almost like an attempt to mute and ratchet down both inequity as well as the unfortunate side effect of progress.
Right.
And I think
we're basically punishing excellence. And that is challenging for long-term growth.
You're minimizing progress to improve the rate of equity of distribution of gains, right? And it's very hard, because by the way, what you're also doing is you're relating a first derivative and a second derivative effect. And so, first order and second order effect. So it becomes a really difficult thing and people don't really see it this way. People see kind of the very, myopic view of, I got to redistribute wealth. I got to help people that are out of jobs. These guys have only seen their income go up by 10%, while everyone else's income's gone up by 40%. And so, politicians, legislators react to that circumstance. But the zooming out is that circumstance arose as we all made progress with respect to security, with respect to health, with respect to food availability, with respect to consumables being cheaper, et cetera, all these great things that progress has given us. And there's a ratcheting effect. The hope I have is that ratcheting isn't too binary. It doesn't flip too far back the other way too fast, in which case you have a socialist state arise, a revolution arise, all the things that we've seen kind of come out of this.
Or people just canceling AP math in California.
Precisely. And then the rippling effect of no more AP math and no more SATs is, fast forward 20 years.
MIT brought back I don't know if you saw this week, MIT brought back SATs as a qualifier after they paused it. I think a lot of people are starting to realize this is a road to nowhere. Sacks, what do you think is, to Chamath's point, is there a solution to get America behind excellence and pragmatic, kind of solutions for immigration? And if there is a way to do that, how would you do it?
Well, I think, like we were talking about, you got to kind of unpack the issue. So like we talked about, strip border security out of it. Don't make that part of it. Then I think you got to differentiate between high skill and low skill immigration, like what you called the point system. I mean, if you look at who's founding companies in Silicon Valley, something like 40% of startups have an immigrant co-founder. So clearly immigrants bring a ton of entrepreneurial energy to the US, but it's in our selfish interest to make sure that the immigrants we're letting in actually have the skills that make them potential founders. So I think would be smart for us to think that way. And you can't even really have that conversation, it seems like today, to have more of a skills-based immigration system. I mean, who's willing to say that?
Well, you could just say 3 buckets. Here's people who need amnesty because they're being persecuted in their country and they're here because of humanitarian reasons. Here's a bucket for high performers who are going to add to our economy and create jobs. And then here's another bucket, which is a lottery and a lineup system. Hey, you want to come here because you don't have skill, but you want to come here because the country's so great. Okay, each of those buckets is going to have its own process, and your odds might be different in each bucket. Is that so hard for people to grok?
Right. But you got to remember, we're sitting in the economy. I mean, it's very easy for us to say this because we are sitting in Silicon Valley, and for us, immigration is an economic good. It's a benefit. But if you are in a part of the country or a part of the economy where you're in a low-wage job, maybe you're a service employee or you're a union employee in the Midwest, the more immigrants that are let in that are low skill, they compete with you and drive your wages down. And that's why people are against it. So that's basically the conundrum is as long as you're talking about immigration as being a single thing, it's going to have a lot of political opposition. That's why we need to, bifurcate it between high skill and low skill. Let in more high skill people and less low skill.
If you had to rank them from least controversial to most controversial, I think letting in high-skilled labor is probably the least controversial thing. Then, and there is always controversy around this, it's always on the bucket of people for humanitarian grounds, right? Some people agree, some people disagree. Should these people be considered refugees? Should they not? How many of your family members should you be able to sponsor? How many not? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's somewhat controversial. But I think we can all agree the most controversial bucket are folks that would otherwise come that would be considered lower skill because they are the ones that really put pressure in very practical, measurable ways into the economy. And we just have to your point, segregate and differentiate how we think about this problem. Because again, if you take immigration, the word away, and actually just use immigration as an input to this equation on population stability, we have population instability right now. So unless we figure out something between live births and deaths, which I don't think we're going to solve tomorrow, it's going to create a very large imbalance that our economy and our country cannot really recover from.
You know what? It's you sparked my thinking there. It really is a framing issue. We should not call high-skilled labor coming here as immigration. We should be flipping that to talent acquisition. We should be looking at it as America is trying to get more talent here so we can win the industries that matter. And if we looked at it as this is talent acquisition, it has nothing to do with immigration. This is us going out and sourcing the smartest people to come here so our companies win against other companies in the global economy to create more jobs for American. Talent acquisition could be something we could be investing in. We should be thinking, how do we win that?
All the problems that ail us, the solution is in some hardworking group of men and women, of which some will be entrepreneurs who want to be here. We're trying to figure out how to actually build our own chips while there are semiconductor experts getting trained, whether here or abroad, who would want to be here to do that job on behalf of the United States, right? We want to figure out climate independence. There are men and women being trained here and abroad who want to be here and solve that problem on behalf of the United States, on and on and on and on. And that's what it means to be, and I'll use a sports analogy, the LA Lakers, right? That's what it means to be, the New England Patriots. Everybody wants to play for you. And so when you're in that position and you have that branding tailwind, you have to use it to your advantage to stack the deck in your favor so that you're constantly winning championships. Otherwise, you're being really derelict in your duty. And I think, hopefully if people look at the broad population level issue that we just exposed because of COVID, there was a stat in this article as an example. In the county of Los Angeles, we are now, in the last 20 years, we've seen a 50% reduction in the birth rate in LA from 150,000 births a year to about 100. And if you forecast that forward, before the turn of the century, the county of Los Angeles will have 0 net births. If you run that's insane.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out how to solve this problem because it really impacts GDP. It impacts all these other issues that Friedberg just talked about as well. The sense of equality and fairness. If we're not creating and growing, we are going to fight over how to split a shrinking pie. And that does tend to lead to revolution.
Yeah, that's when it could get really gnarly. We're not growing. Entrepreneurs are not coming here. New jobs are not being created. Imagine if Amazon wasn't created.
The historical implications for what Friedberg said are really well defined in history. If you go back thousands of years, you look at every single time, an empire goes through that period of decline, when they have net negative growth, economic growth, and they have this sort of rising populism, what they end up doing is they end up fighting. And they have different ways of fighting, right? But they end up fighting over how to reallocate a shrinking pie. And there are many of those outcomes when they fight that ends up in, really turbulent moments in history.
Well, and that's where this wealth tax,
that's where we have a responsibility to make sure you don't end up going through, a Russia scenario, a China scenario, and there are more productive ways to solve these problems.
Oh, and that's where the wealth tax that was floated, which seems it's DOA already, but this concept of everybody who's over $100 million having to assess all their worth and give 20% back minimum each year is that dividing of the pie. And I think, maybe they can allocate less money towards.
Can we all agree that, on the margins, when you make a lot of money, you can and should pay more taxes? I don't think that's a super controversial idea. On the margins, if you are a massive polluter, you should pay some taxes to compensate for the damage you're creating to the environment. These are not controversial ideas. The problem is that, what Sacks said is true. You take a sensible concept and then you pervert it because you have to contort it with all this language to make it political, and it loses all of its value in it. And so, for example, why does the administration have to write this potential law or proposal, in a way that so obviously violates the Constitution of the United States? Are they that dumb? I don't think they're that dumb. But they do it to appease some political aspect of the Democratic Party. And then as a result, it becomes DOA. Within 8 minutes of it being announced, Manchin says this is dead. What is the point of that theater?
It's virtue signaling. Yeah.
Aren't you a donor? You should know, right? What would they tell you? I mean, what's the Democratic Party saying about...
I think what they would say off the record is that these were sacrificial totems to the progressive left, meaning that they do it for window dressing to destroy. It's like throwing a cat a ball of yarn.
It seems like that populist progressive left is becoming a bigger base than it was historically.
In the Democratic Party, it is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how big it is, but in the Democratic Party, look, it's where all the energy is in the Democratic Party, and it's where a lot of the donors are. That is who's driving the agenda in the Democratic Party today. That is why the Democrats are going to get shellacked in November. Read Roy Teixeira's Substack. He is the Democratic political consultant who wrote The Emerging Democratic Majority, predicting, this is back in 2002. He wrote a book about how there would be a new Democratic coalition of young voters and minorities and women, and they would come together, and that would create, Democratic majorities and Democratic presidents forever. And then Obama wins in 2008, and it looks like Teixeira's prediction's coming true. And he recently, in the last 2 years, has been warning that something's happened that he could never have predicted, which is that working class voters are now moving out of the Democratic Party. Not just whites, but also Hispanics and Asians, even black voters who are working class. They're all moving to the Republican Party. So he believes the Republican Party is losing its natural majority. Why? Because progressives have taken over, and on cultural and social issues, they are much more liberal than the working class of this country. So basically what's happened is the Democrats have become a professional class party, and the Republicans are in the process of transforming into a working class party, and that's turning everything upside down. But ultimately, with Youngkin winning in Virginia last year, and I think the Republicans on a generic ballot are up plus 10, plus 12. I mean, they're going to have a huge, I think, wave in November. You got to remember that professionals, meaning college-educated voters, are only about a third of the electorate. I think about 37%. And then the other 63% are working class. The working class does not like this extreme socio-cultural progressive agenda. They don't like seeing their statues ripped down. They don't like this sort of what they see as kind of this antagonism towards American history and American icons. They don't believe in socialism, and so on down the line. And the Democratic Party is increasingly speaking only to itself. I mean, they are in an echo chamber. And I think these progressives are going to have to lose a few elections before they realize. I mean, the same thing happened to the Democratic Party back in the 1980s, right? You had Ronald Reagan and then George Herbert Walker Bush win 3 landslide elections, 1980, 1984, 88. And then the Democrats nominate these like horrible candidates, Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Dukakis. And then who comes along? Bill Clinton comes along.
Easy on the Greeks. Easy on the Greeks. Dukakis was pretty great.
Okay, like we found the one fan. We found the one fan.
Terrible.
Who comes along? He was terrible. Who comes along in 1992? Bill Clinton, and he has this whole new faction within the Democratic Party, the DLC, and his explicit mandate was to lead them back to the center. And then he chooses Al Gore as his running mate to double down on that image. I don't think Al Gore actually was that centrist. I think but his image at that time was that he was pretty centrist.
He was.
So you had yes. I mean, I think at that time. So. Their Democratic Party had to lose for about 12 years before they nominated a candidate and put him at the leadership of the party who could drag them back to the center. Now, listen, I mean, all we have right now are foreshadowings of this. We have the Youngkin victory last year. We have the fact those 3 school board members in San Francisco got kicked out. We'll see what happens to Chesa Boudin on June 7th. So we're getting these glimmers, and I think November will be a big test. But where I think this thing is headed is that the working class voters of this country don't like this radical progressive shift in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is going to keep losing until they're willing to make changes.
Well, immigration is just such an easy one. And courting the working person is what the Democrats did forever. So I don't know how they can screw this up.
Well, but remember, working class voters are not in favor of immigration, J. Cal. They do not want unlimited number of immigrants coming.
Well, they don't want unlimited, but they would like to see their family members
and driving their wages down.
But they do want their family members to be allowed in. So for the folks who
you talk to Hispanic voters who are citizens in America, they are not in favor of unlimited immigration because that creates wage pressure for them.
Reasonable.
I'm telling you, that it's not like what you think. The higher you are economically in the social strata, the more professional you are, the more you like immigration. Because, like, for people like us, we like immigrants because they found companies and we invest in them. We see the economic vitality that they bring. But if you are a working class, okay, you do not want that wage pressure. You just don't. So unless the Democrats figure out a way to talk about it the way we're talking about it, where we separate high skill and low skill, they will lose with that message.